and welcome to today's edition of The Full Scottish on Broadcasting Scotland. My name's Ruth Watson. My guests today are Francis Coppola and former SNP MP Dr. Philippa Whitford. Hi, thanks for joining me today, guys.
Good morning.
Well, before we come to our discussion about the news of the day, we'll first go to the Ukraine update on day 837 of Russia's war in Ukraine. French President Emmanuel Macron and US President Joe Biden have aligned their country's support for Ukraine and opposition to Russia during Biden's state visit in Paris. A joint roadmap released by the presidents included a commitment to support efforts to use frozen Russian assets to help Kyiv. Tapping profits from Russian assets has drawn concerns from some countries, but a US Treasury official said this week that the US and its G7 partners were making progress. Biden said if Putin succeeds in his war with Ukraine, he would not stop there. It's about much more than Ukraine. All of Europe will be threatened, but we're not going to let that happen, he said. The United States is standing strong with Ukraine. We are standing with our allies, and we are standing with France. On Saturday, the Ukrainian Air Force said that Ukrainian air defense shot down 9 out of 13 Russian drones over the central Poltava region, southeastern Zaporizhzhia and Dnipropetrovsk regions, and the Kharkiv region in the northeast. Dnipropetrovsk regional governor Serhiy Lizak said the overnight drone attack damaged commercial and residential buildings. A Ukrainian military spokesperson has said Ukraine now controlled more than half of the town of Vovchansk, a flashpoint for fighting since Russia launched a renewed offensive in Ukraine's northeastern Kharkiv region last month. Russia-installed officials have claimed that at least 28 people are dead after Ukrainian strikes on parts of the Russian-held Luhansk and Kherson regions. Russia and Ukraine continued to exchange drone attacks overnight into Saturday. A Ukrainian attack on the town of Sadov in the Kherson region on Friday is reported to have killed 22 and wounded 15 people. On Saturday, Leonid Pasechenik, the Russian-installed governor in the partially occupied Luhansk region, said that 2 more bodies had been pulled from the rubble following Ukraine's missile attack. Russian forces have installed 8 barges on the southern side of the Kerch Bridge in Crimea in an effort to defend the bridge and shipping channel, according to the UK Ministry of Defence's latest intelligence update. The barges are also an attempt to reduce the angles of approach for Ukrainian unmanned surface vehicles. Installation had begun by the 10th of May and was completed on the 22nd of May after previously installed barges were damaged by storms. On Saturday, Ukrainian officials said there was an attempt on the life of the ex-mayor of Kupiansk, a city in Ukraine's northeastern Kharkiv region. The main intelligence directorate of Ukraine's Ministry of Defense said Hanidi Matsesora was in critical condition after he was attacked on Friday in Russia's Belgorod region, bordering Ukraine. Officials said he voluntarily agreed to full cooperation when Russian troops invaded, and in June 2022 signed the so-called Protocol for the Creation of the Occupation Kharkiv Administration. After the Ukrainian armed forces took back control of Kupiansk, Matsehora had escaped with the Russians to the Belgorod region, Ukrainian intelligence said. Well, moving on to the situation in Gaza, at least 36,801 Palestinians have been killed and more than 86,680 injured in Gaza since the 7th of October last year. As the world welcomes the release of 4 Israeli hostages, it raises questions about the relative value of Israeli and Palestinian lives. Well, I mean, Philippa, you're somebody with a very good knowledge of Gaza. You've worked out there in your capacity as a breast surgeon on several occasions. I mean, listening to the numbers of deaths that came about with the release of these 4 hostages, and of course, it is appalling that anybody's been kept hostage for this length of time. And of course, the 7th of October was horrific. But the slaughter of Palestinians in the meantime, what does it tell you, as a doctor, what does it tell you about the relative value of a Palestinian life and the way in which that is framed?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think there's no question that within Israel, particularly within the Israeli government, Palestinian lives are considered completely expendable. But actually, we also see that in the international community. I can't imagine anyone who wasn't shocked by what happened on the 7th of October. And we need to remember that the pain of a bereaved mother in Israel is no less than the pain of a bereaved mother in Gaza. But equally, that works the other way round. And while Israel indeed has the right to self defense, as any country does, the slaughter, as you describe it, and I would completely agree with that description, that we've seen over the last 8 months can't be described as self defense. There were 105 hostages who were rescued as part of the ceasefire deal last November, and only 7 that have been rescued through military action, one almost immediately after the 7th of October, 2 in February, and now these 4. But the estimates of those killed is between 1 and 200 Palestinians in Gaza, and described as possibly 200 or more who are injured. Going to the 2 remaining hospitals in the center portion of the Gaza Strip, which frankly are barely functional. You know, we're describing them as hospitals, but they are almost now reduced to first aid posts and trying to deal with 86,000 injured. Many of them, like among the killed, are women and children, thousands of children who have lost limbs. You know, the disability, the post traumatic stress disorder, the outcome of this in the long term for the people of Gaza is immensely destructive. As you say, I lived and worked. I lived and worked for almost 18 months in the early 90s, and then started returning in 2016 when I set up a breast cancer project between Scotland and Gaza. So I still have a lot of friends and colleagues in Gaza, and the displacement, the bereavement they have suffered, including one very good friend who lost 48 members of his family when his home was bombed, including 3 children and 3 grandchildren. This description of Palestinians as if they're not human, as if they are expendable, is very strong within the Israeli government, but it's almost also reflected within the international political community and media, as if these are just numbers, and they're not numbers. They are beautiful human beings who are being killed on an absolutely appalling scale.
I was thinking this morning when we heard the news come through that a body has been found on the island of Greece where Dr. Michael Mosley has gone missing. And I was saying to my husband, it's really odd, isn't it? Because I feel quite sad. You know, oh, Dr. Michael Mosley, oh, I've seen him on the telly. Oh, that's really sad. And I was really invested in kind of, oh, will they find him? Won't they find him? And I said to my husband this morning, that's somebody that we've never met. And yet there's all these thousands of Palestinians being slaughtered, and they're equally valuable. But where's all the news about them, and where's this kind of public outpouring? And I mean, Francis, what does it say about us as people, as a society, that one person goes missing and we're all rooting for him, but thousands just a few hundred miles away are being slaughtered, and we kind of just go meh?
I think it's what we do. It's we kind of identify with people who we think are ours, and the people who we think are ours are of more value, or they're more people, more human than people who aren't ours. I mean, I think Lewis Carroll expressed this rather well in Alice in Wonderland, I think, where Alice was introduced to a pudding, I think it was. Pudding meet Alice, Alice meet the pudding, right, move the pudding. And the point was, once you'd been introduced to the pudding, it had become a person, you couldn't eat it. And I think that kind of encapsulates where we are. As long as you don't name people, as long as they aren't real, they're just numbers. It doesn't matter how many you kill. Once you know who they are, once they have a name, once they have a family, once they have a wife who says what's happened is unbearable, once they have children who miss their father, all this kind of thing. Once you have that, it becomes much more difficult to talk. That's when you get the outpourings of grief and solidarity. And Israel particularly has worked very hard to generate that kind of fellow feeling with the hostages. I think it's fair to say that in general the media has not worked that hard to create the same kind of fellow feeling for Palestinians.
I mean, I
We were
was
seeing
sent a
your
montage, Ruth, from my friend who lost so many members of his family. It was the birthday of his daughter on Tuesday. She was an Erasmus student at Glasgow, DEMA. Many people who attend the healthcare vigils for Gaza in Glasgow will be aware of her because there's a banner marking her death. Um, and they had a montage of the 48 people, you know, beautiful family photographs like you would see in an album of people celebrating things or just taking selfies in a garden, etc. And I shared that on my social media because I think it's important that people realize that the Gazans are not numbers. And while the pain of the hostage families in Israel wondering whether their hostage is still alive, their family member is still alive, whether they'll ever come back home or not, is also similar to the families of the missing in Gaza, the kind of 7 to 10,000 that are estimated to be under the rubble somewhere. You know, that kind of looking and not knowing is an incredibly painful thing. And I think we need to be careful that we don't diminish the suffering or pain on either side. But what we are seeing in Gaza is slaughter and collective punishment. It's revenge and retribution. And to be honest, a ceasefire deal that would allow the hostages to be released alive would bring more of them home. Only 7, including these 4, have been released by military means. And therefore, that is not going to be successful to get the remaining hostages out. There needs to be negotiation of a ceasefire, because what's going on, if it's allowed to go on further, the slaughter is just leading us to an abyss of hatred and violence.
But I mean, it seems to be, as an outside perspective, sort of viewer's analysis of it, it seems to be that the Israeli government isn't really actively looking to sort the things out politically, because when you see the families of those who have been taken hostage, the Israeli families of those who've been taken hostage, have been beaten by the Israeli police, have been attacked by the Israeli government, have been traduced by the Israeli government. So it seems as though there's Netanyahu, obviously, who's facing all sorts of criminal charges, and the sort of very far right Zionists that he's in government with. I mean, it definitely seems as though they have an agenda that goes way beyond hostages or peace. But as we look at the International Criminal Court and the International Court of Justice, we see, for example, Norway and Spain and other nations recognizing Palestine as a state. And now we're starting to hear language from Joe Biden, his government's been very, very hawkish and very unsympathetic towards the humanity and the statehood of the Palestinians. Now we're starting to see this language changing. Do you think that this is the route to peace? Is that because of because of this legal ruling that what is happening, that Israel is in is breaking international law? Francis, what do you make of the route ahead for the people of Palestine, and will they have paid a terrible price to eventually gain freedom?
I wish I could think that this would be the route to peace, but I don't think that it is. I think that the international rules-based order has become something of a joke, because countries like Israel, when they feel like it, and I have to say Russia, it's interesting, we started with Ukraine. Russia is a permanent member of the Security Council. And America at times. I mean, we shouldn't forget what America did after 9/11, Abu Ghraib and Guantanamo Bay and things like that, and the millions of people probably who've died in Iraq and Afghanistan in the aftermath of 9/11, and the chaos that exists in the Middle East because of that. It's very hard to argue that action at the international courts now has any teeth at all. it's just going to be ignored as long as Israel has the backing of the US. So the route to peace is going to be, for how long does the United States tolerate this? And what is the United States going to insist on as the resolution to this? For me, there's a great deal of talk about two-state solutions, and I look at the situation on the ground in Israel and Palestine and think, where is this two states going to be? I read the roadmap that the Trump presidency put out regarding a two-state solution, and what it meant by two states was not anything that anybody really would recognise as a state for the Palestinians, and it certainly wasn't anything that was going to be acceptable to the Palestinians. So Biden has never rode back from that. So that's his idea of a two-state solution. It's a non-starter. So right now, I am not hopeful that this is going anywhere. And I'm also very worried that the language from Israel about Lebanon is also becoming increasingly hawkish. And I think that they will invade Lebanon fairly soon.
I mean, Philippa, it's Netanyahu several months ago now showed a map showing a greater Israel. Do you think that in a time, and we were looking at this kind of global move where we've got Russia looking to, reassert sort of ancient borders, China looking to with a sort of a greater expansionist philosophy, a continuing expansionist philosophy, and now Israel. I mean, it's quite Orwellian, but I mean, do you think that we're in a time of sort of where the far right are on the rise and they're sort of marching to try and establish this sort of tradition of the fairly ghastly strongman and despots?
Well, I think there's a degree of that, but I think Israel Palestine is a separate issue from Russia, China, whatever. If you buy a map in Israel, it won't show the West Bank as the West Bank at all. It's just called Judea and Samaria. So there's no acceptance. And obviously we had Netanyahu in recent years talking about passing legislation to annex the West Bank. He is blatant in his expansionism towards a greater Israel. And there had been talk as far back as 2013 of wanting to basically ethnically cleanse Gaza. And we're not hearing anything from Israel at all about any vision for post-war. What even is it they're aiming for? And therefore, that's the fear, that they're literally trying to make Gaza so unlivable that either they drive people out now, or because all infrastructure has been destroyed, there is no point in people staying. I mean, 90% of the hospitals are, severely damaged or non-functional. When David Knott, the renowned war surgeon, was there in recent months, he said that in the other conflicts he'd been in, including Syria, he had never seen the destruction of health infrastructure. Over 500 healthcare workers killed. All the universities, all 12 universities have been bombed, including the 2 medical schools. So there's almost 2,000 medical students with no medical school. And a charity called PalMed have set up an academy to try and do online teaching. The schools that have been bombed, the UN schools that have been bombed, over 80% of housing units. So you can't help but feel that there is this risk that the vision in Gaza is literally to either destroy the Palestinians or to drive them out. And we did hear members of his government talking about, other countries should be willing to take them in as refugees when they leave Gaza. So it's hard to know what Israel's vision of this is. And I've always said that it's bizarre to talk about a two-state solution when the international community, or the leaders of the international community, refuse to recognize two states. So in the end of the day, we need to talk to the Palestinians about what their vision is. There are some in the Palestinian community who actually talk about a one-state solution, where Israelis and Palestinians would live beside each other with equal rights. Now, the problem is the power dynamic between the two at the moment, and the determination of the right wing in Israel to have, in essence, an almost pure Jewish state, basically goes against that. I think the only thing that I can hang on to at the moment in all this horror is for international leaders to recognize that the status quo ante before 7th of October is not a solution. And hopefully not to take the approach as has been taken after previous invasions in 2008, 9, 2014, etc., that when things quiet down in Gaza, we move on to something else. That literally a solution is required, and it has to be a solution that recognizes Palestinian sovereignty and human rights, because it's literally only a just peace of whatever shape that is, and that needs to have Palestinian voices driving it, that will give security and peace to both communities, both Israeli and Palestinian.
I mean, as we're looking at a sort of something of a shift, I mean, I think the sort of the Trump presidency saw something of a shift within Europe and the sort of the European perspective, and there was very much a sort of sense among European leaders, sort of with Brexit happening and then Trump, that actually Europe needed to sort of step forward and take its own place, and not rely on America as being the sort of the big superpower that looked after everything. And yet, as hundreds of millions of EU member states go to the polls for the European parliamentary elections today, the final day of voting, I mean, we still are seeing uncomfortable moves among the far right, and talk of serious evidence of Russian interference in supporting the far right. I mean, Francis, what's your perspective on the EU as being a kind of a hopeful bastion that may end up, sort of helping ease democracy in the global the global state, or even our local state, against these sort of these forces that perhaps seek to disrupt us?
That has been actually historically the EU's role, and it's unfortunate that increasing number of people within the EU seem to think it hasn't done it awfully well, which I think is more than slightly unfair, because I think it's done it extremely well, actually. But the EU has its own problems. It's got forces within it that want to reassert national sovereignty, or even sort of outright nationalism. It'll be interesting to see what happens in the elections, because we have been seeing increased support for the far right, and it may well be that makes its presence felt in the form of a stronger presence for the far right in the European Parliament. And that's an uncomfortable place to be, because the very disease that you could say the EU is invented to prevent would then be infecting it again.
But I mean, Poland sort of flirted with the far right and then sort of kicked them out. I mean, Geert Wilders, he hasn't been able to form a government. I mean, unusually, Giorgia Meloni is as a far right prime minister. Although, of course, she referred when the UK government came over, she said it was nice to meet other far right leaders. So that shows you what Europeans think of what's happening in London. But yeah, I mean, even Meloni, they seem to be less disruptive about the EU because of Brexit. There's quite a lot of campaigning have been pointing to Brexit to say this is what happens when you leave. I mean, Philippa, do you have a perspective on the narrative around? I mean, I know with your German connections that you will be very well rooted in what's happening there.
Well, I think there's no question that, as Francis says, we have seen a rise in far right parties and indeed governments within Europe over the last 10 to 15 years. And of course, we don't know what the election is going to bring. Some countries, as Britain would have done if we were still in the EU, we would have voted on Thursday, others vote today. So we need to wait and see the outcome. But looking at the predictions, what you have when you look at the far right, now the radical right are likely to be the biggest part of that. The extreme far right, including Alternative für Deutschland, AfD, don't like them. So, they are there. It's not like they are a cohesive group of far right parties that will function as a bloc. They're all squabbling like cats in a sack. And the question is therefore whether the centre, including centre-right conservatives, the socialists, the Liberals, and indeed possibly even the Greens as things go forward, whether they can work together to hold the centre, because they would still be the largest groupings within the parliament. But we have seen that, and as Francis was saying, both the European human rights, the Court of Human Rights, the Convention on Human Rights, that came up after the Second World War, and which eventually led to where we are with the EU. A lot of that was to bring peace to Europe, and it has brought peace to Europe. And in all of the Brexit debates that obviously I sat through in Westminster, the EU has never been given credit as a vehicle of peace. And being from Belfast, what is often completely overlooked is the role that the EU played in leading to the Good Friday Agreement, both from providing a neutral space for John Major and Albert Reynolds to discover that actually they liked each other, they could do business, they could start to discuss, and also the massive inpouring of funding. And then with all of Ireland being under the EU, a lot of issues of friction simply evaporating away, and we've seen that friction come back because of Brexit. So the EU has always had a role about stability, peace and security within Europe. What they are having to pick up because of the threat of another Trump presidency is the security aspect of that and the defense aspect of that becoming bigger. Where they have completely underestimated themselves, us having just discussed Israel-Palestine, is the potential that they have had to be a strong voice in the world for cooperation and security. They have too often just seen themselves as an economic bloc instead of realizing that when you bring all the voices of Europe together, you can be a very strong and powerful voice for peace and security globally, not just regionally.
And do you think that that will impact, impact these elections? Because with the war in Ukraine and Viktor Orban and his very sort of pro-Russian views, I mean, there's been huge rallies and protests across Hungary, concern about that. I mean, and a lot of conversation happening from Finland through Poland and down, talking about the threat that Russia poses. I mean, do you think that do you get any sense that people in across the mainland of Europe are understanding finally that actually this is the opportunity that Europe has to keep peace on the continent? I mean, Philippa, is that something that you're aware of?
I think particularly people from the eastern part of Europe, particularly the Baltic states, I mean, they are very well aware of the threat. Finland has never ceased to be aware of the threat. They've always been conscious that Russia is on a very long border with them. And so I think people in Eastern Europe are very conscious of that and of the importance of the strength of the EU, and that may have contributed to the slight rapprochement within Poland from flirting with the far right. Obviously, Orban and Hungary is an issue, but as you say, you're starting to get popular voices, marching, protesting, who are afraid of Hungary being picked up and picked off. It's the same with freedom of movement. I remember visiting Berlin in the autumn of 2016, and there were members on the delegation saying to members of the German government, oh, if you would only give up on freedom of movement, we would stay. And I pointed out where we were sitting. We were in the foreign ministry, which was in East Berlin, behind the wall. Our sense of what freedom of movement means within the UK and the sense in Germany and everything east of Germany is totally different. And it's the same. The UK failure to value the strength of the EU and its contribution to peace would not be reflected if you were looking at Central European countries, Eastern European countries, either affected by the Second World War or more to the east by the threat of Russia and indeed earlier Russian occupation. So I think there will be that growing recognition that if you allow this to crumble and splinter, and if you do not support Ukraine, then Russia will have no reason to stop. And there will be countries, there will be that popular memory in countries like the Czech Republic, Slovakia, etc., of the 60s, of the oppression by Russia. So I think the feeling and the recognition there from parents and grandparents will be much stronger than what we have here in the UK. So I think there will be that recognition, and we just hope that it shows in the voting today for the EU Parliament.
In Francis, the bringing it back to a sort of more Scottish perspective, there was there's an organisation called Scotland for Europe, and they were putting out tweets the other day saying that there's 36 MEPs who've signed up saying that they will support Scotland's re-entry into the EU once we get independence. Do you think that that is something which is within the wider European consciousness? And do you think that it's something that you're a viewer from England? Do you think it's something which is a conversation you can see gaining traction, and perhaps through these general election conversations, people going, oh, hang on a second, Scotland might have a route back? I mean, is that something which you think is realistic?
It's been on the cards actually for a very long time. Scotland has always said that, well, since Brexit or since the Brexit referendum, that in the event that it got independence, it would be looking to rejoin the EU. So that's not a new conversation, and if anything, support for that is increasing. So the question really is, what would that, if in the event of Scotland gaining independence, how would the EU address that? I think that most countries in the EU would look on it favourably. I don't see that they would want to put obstacles in the way of Scotland joining. And also, what would it do for the relationship between Scotland and the UK, which might be more problematic? But one of the things we're seeing is growing momentum in the UK, in England and Wales, for a closer relationship with the EU and stronger support even for rejoining. So maybe there's hope for all of it to come back together in the end.
I mean, Philippa, I noticed that Stephen Flynn at the debate the other day, the seven leader or 7 party debate the other day, he didn't talk about Scotland rejoining the EU. Which is an SNP policy. He interestingly was talking about Scotland rejoining the single market, and I wondered if that was his way of trying to slide something which was more a narrative that was more acceptable to English viewers, to sort of like discomfit Labour, the Lib Dems, and the Tories. I mean, what was your perspective on why he chose that particular wording?
I think that I would love to see the whole UK returning to the EU at some point, but I think this is going to be like turning an oil tanker, and it's not something that's going to happen quickly. So Labour have already said, "Oh, we're not rejoining. We're not interested in that." So I think what Stephen was talking about is Labour are not even talking about looking at what they could do short of fully rejoining the EU that might ease some of the pain of Brexit. I mean, Brexit's an utter catastrophe. The benefits of Brexit, I'm sorry, there aren't any. So, I think it's more simply talking about that. Talking about rejoining would be talking about us rejoining through independence. And having been the Europe spokesperson for the SNP for 2 years, it was quite striking when Brexit was completed at the beginning, or completed, it's not completed yet, but, when the UK formally left the EU, and then, traveling to Brussels or Berlin or meeting ambassadors in London, the kind of almost that they felt released to express their sympathy and their interest in Scotland. And, there's many reasons we would want to join the EU. There's no question about that. And while Francis said, yes, it does create a challenge because you have a border to England, but you're actually removing 31 borders to the EU and the EEA. And those are borders that are really troublesome for us. A lot of our exports are actually not on the back of a lorry. They're either in a pipe as gas or petrol or electricity, or they are digital, such as financial services. But yet all of them lose out by not being part of the EU. So I think he probably was trying to very much be talking about what Labour could even be talking about doing. But as we saw in the debate of Sunak and Starmer last Monday, they didn't mention Scotland at all, nor Wales for that matter. But equally, they didn't mention Brexit really, and it's so there's this omerta of not talking about the elephant in the room and the damage it's been doing. And it could be that if Scotland goes back as an independent country, that obviously you start to almost have a bridge, and there would be a wake up for, as Francis says, there are many people, a majority of people in England who realise that even if they voted for it, Brexit is a failure. And so an independent Scotland going back is something that could create that bridge. And we're not going empty handed. Scotland is sitting in a very important geostrategic position between Greenland and Norway. We are big producers and have huge potential in green energy. We have a burgeoning space industry. We provide a lot of the key UK exports, certainly in food and drink, with whiskey and salmon. We have a very high ratio of universities that are recognized for their research. So there's a lot of things. We're not going, as we're often described, oh, you're as poor as Greece, or you're going empty handed, holding out a tin cup. It's not at all. There's a lot of interest in Europe, particularly in Scotland's energy resource and energy expertise. So I think that Scotland, as Francis said, would very much be welcome back in. But first step is we need to win that independence.
I mean, Francis, looking at the sort of the fiscal conversation, there seems to be quite also sort of, I mean, as Stephen Flynn and Rian Apiawar, who would have had it, sort of downright lies or dishonesty coming from Labour, and Penny Mordaunt was fact checked more than once about her £2,000 claim. I mean, the serious economics raised by the Institute for Fiscal Studies and other economists, with both the Labour and the Tories saying they're going to stick to the same fiscal rules, and the SNP obviously saying that is going to lead to austerity on stilts, or just basically as I can't remember the name of the Green who she was saying you can't put a cigarette paper between Labour and the Tories on fiscal rules. Well, looking at the disaster that the Tories have made of our fiscal situation, how are Labour going to do anything that's different, or bring any hope to people? What's your view as an economist? What's your perspective on the narrative around this election?
Well, I'm actually really disappointed that Labour seems to have want to park its tanks on the Tories' lawn. I'm wondering who they're trying to attract, because this isn't what voters need or want. It's like all the tax cuts that the Tories keep promising, and poll after poll shows that what people actually want is better services. We've got people like the National Institute for Economic and Social Research calling for more investment, please, more public investment, please raise it. This unholy alliance of them and the Resolution Foundation, of all people, saying we have to have more investment. These are mainstream economic think tanks saying both parties are getting it wrong. The fiscal rules don't make any sense. That we don't need austerity 2.0. Austerity 1.0 is quite bad enough, and this would be way worse. And we cannot wait any longer for the priming of the pump with public investment to try and get some to repair our infrastructure, to encourage green industries and all the rest of it, and try and get business investment going, and try and improve our productivity, which are the real issues that everybody is facing. We won't have real wage growth until we can get productivity up.
But I mean, even Labour's big plan of GB Energy, which they say will be headquartered in Scotland, now, as Stephen Flynn pointed out, it's Scotland's energy, it's Scotland's winds, it's Scotland's waves. So actually, it's just sort of like Westminster trying to suck that cash cow dry once more. but I mean, in terms of GB Energy, there seems to be real confusion with one, Anna Sarwar saying, "Oh, it's going to be generating energy," but Keir Starmer's made it quite clear that it's going to be an investment vehicle. So is it not just going to be sort of PFI on stilts? I mean, what's I mean, Francis, do you think that this is the waters are being muddied around GB Energy because it's like this sort of chimera that Labour want it to be whatever you want it to be? There's this vision of joy and wealth that's going to cornucopia that's going to shower down upon us all, rather than the reality. I mean, why aren't Labour being honest and clear about their policies? And what do you think it is?
Again, I'm disappointed because I would have expected, given the energy companies managed to make of everything, that a Labour government would bite the bullet and say, enough of this, we need energy supply in public ownership. That would be consistent with, Labour Party principles and so forth. And they seem to have backed away from that and gone for this kind of, oh, well, we'll provide some public investment essentially into the private sector industries. Well, this has not worked well anywhere else. So why would it work well in energy? I'm not getting it. So it all looks a bit half-baked to me, and I'm quite sad about it.
But why do you think that they've come up with this as their big policy plan? I mean, what is it that they are? What is the plan, or is it just a good soundbite? I mean,
Well,
do
I
you have
think the
any?
ambition.
I mean, is there any explanation?
Well, I think the ambition of trying to get more finance into renewable energy is a good one. Um, and using public investment for that is eminently fine. If this was to act like, say, a green investment bank, I wouldn't have a problem with it. I just don't think it's enough because I think distribution matters. And we've still got customers being held to ransom by energy companies. How is that a good idea? So I'm disappointed, as I said, by the Labour tiptoeing round the edge of nationalisation in several sectors, saying, oh, we're not going to nationalise anything, because whenever we threaten to nationalise swathes of UK utilities, people start thinking we're going back to the 1970s and are not going to vote for us. And again, I think, who exactly are they trying to attract? Because a good many of the people of this country now don't even remember the 1970s. I do. But even I was a child at the time. They seem to be trying to attract the votes of the old.
I mean, Philippa, not to say that we're the votes of the old, but I mean, I remember sort of sitting around candles in the winter of discontent. But I mean, you have sat round the candles of Westminster and must be aware of some of these machinations. What's your perspective on the GB Energy plan and why it's come out of England, or why it's come out of Westminster, and how that's playing on the doors in Scotland? What's your perspective?
Well, I think the GB Energy narrative is frankly just dishonest. Your description of it as a massive PFI of Scotland's energy potential, I think, is pretty close to the mark. And if you look at the use that Labour put PFI to in public sector, schools, hospitals, literally governments, local authorities are paying 5 to 10 times the value of a building because it was done through PFI, and are still saddled health boards and local authorities with paying millions every year that actually make it hard to balance their budget. So I think it's a soundbite. I think it is literally deliberately to pull the wool over the public's eyes, giving the impression it was going to be a public, nationalized generation company and supply company that might actually control prices for customers. Whereas at the moment we see, fuel poverty in Scotland is about a third of households, and yet Scotland is generating energy that is being exported. And also we saw after the invasion of Ukraine, we saw the spike not just in the gas price, but also in the price of electricity, because there's this bizarre system where the highest price of gas is used to set the price of electricity. despite Scotland getting most of its electricity from renewables and wind not being any more expensive. So, whatever, we keep hearing this narrative, if we drill more oil and drill more gas, that'll give us energy security and prices will go down. No, the energy companies are private and they sell it on the open market. And I think, this whole issue ties in with what Francis was talking about, austerity 2.0. We had 15 years of austerity that meant that the UK public sector was already struggling before hit by the pandemic. And therefore, we struggled to deal with the pandemic because health, social care, everything was already on its knees. And the idea that we could face now another decade of austerity under Labour shows that both Tory and Labour are using this Thatcherite approach. And indeed, we've heard leaders in the Labour Party, including Starmer, praising Margaret Thatcher. Now, she had this narrative of you have to have the money in your purse. A country is like a household, it can only spend what it has collected. That's nonsense. A country is like a business. And if a business is not investing in training staff, buying up to date equipment, developing new products, marketing them, then it's dead. And it's the same with a government. A government should be investing in infrastructure, in skills training, in modernization, in communication and connectivity, both physical and digital, so that industries can actually function and be successful. Whereas what they've done is, it may look good on the Treasury balance sheet for a year, or we're not giving any money away, we're keeping it all in the Treasury. But what it does is it kills local economies. And what we've ended up with in Scotland and right across the UK is dead high streets because of benefit cuts, because of budget cuts to the Welsh and Scottish budgets, to local authorities, that mean there just isn't the money in a local economy, and therefore there isn't tax going back. So, George Osborne's vision of austerity only lasting till 2015 didn't work. And yet here we are having Labour planning to continue it with up to 20 billion of public sector cuts coming in because they plan to match exactly what the Tories are doing. And that doesn't make any sense. I would agree with Francis absolutely. If you listen to the public voice, it is, I'm willing to pay tax. I'm willing to pay what I have to if I can have public services that myself and my family can rely on. And why we can't get the two main parties to recognise that, in the same way as the Scottish government follows the well-being approach to the economy and invest in people and place, I don't know. They can't see it. I'm a surgeon. I can see it. I don't understand why they can't see it.
I mean, so getting back to the GB issue, though, I mean, the Scottish government could have set up a Scottish energy company. I mean, it could be, it may well be that the UK government would have, done a Section 35 and overruled that because they wanted this GB News scenario, this GB Energy. But I mean, it's surely Scotland could have done something along those lines with the powers that it had.
And
Why?
no, and energy powers, the main energy powers are reserved. So categorically, with the winding back of devolution, with this muscular unionism, you would certainly have seen that. When Nicola Sturgeon proposed in 2017 an energy company, they did look at it. A committee in Holyrood looked at it. What they were talking about was a supply company, with the aim that, oh, well, we could maybe buy energy really cheaply and sell it with virtually no profit and bring prices down. When the committee in Holyrood looked into it, they found that the supply side was very over supplied with companies. The profit margin was very narrow and the risk would be high. And indeed, we saw in recent years many energy supply companies go bankrupt and go out of business. You need to have complete power over the generation. And obviously, right back when Mrs. Thatcher privatized Brit Oil to BP, and what comes is selling the licenses and the tax on oil or energy, and all of that goes to the Treasury. So the Scottish government doesn't have the range of powers that would be needed to set up a nationalised generation company. And if it was that it was to buy out some of the private companies, then obviously Scotland doesn't have the borrowing powers. That's a critical part of any government, to allow them to invest in infrastructure, whether that's energy infrastructure or digital infrastructure, that makes your productivity improve, that controls the supply and the prices to people. It's exactly that. It's invest, then you get a growing economy, and you are able to have a more social access to whether it's water or energy or communications. Then you start to get this increase in productivity. The Scottish government, their borrowing powers are minuscule in comparison to the task at hand. And there's no question in my mind that had they tried to do it, it would have been either a Section 35 or use of the Internal Market Act or whatever to block it, as we've seen over recent years.
I mean, Francis, I mean, obviously, for many people in Scotland, they would say, well, of course, Scotland needs the powers of independence to be able to utilise fully the opportunity and potential before us. But looking at, for example, GB Energy, and the sort of the mishmash and the obfuscation and the, well, it's this on one hand and it's that on the other hand, does this show how economically illiterate many of us are when we have these conversations, and how poor a job our media is doing, that we don't understand it either? You know, I mean, it's how easy is it for political parties to slide through mistruths when it's neither reported nor understood on a UK-wide level?
It's unfortunately all too easy, because actually the level of economic understanding in this country is abysmal, and the media doesn't get it right a lot of the time. It's been something I've complained about literally for years, about the kind of way in which economics is presented on the mainstream media and the kind of things that are discussed, which often are not really what we should be talking about. And that's kind of where we are now, where what we're talking about is, this glorified PFI thing. Is it an investment bank? Is it a financial vehicle? Is it something else? I don't know. Rather than straightforward, we'll just have a national energy company. And all the ways in which Westminster holds power to itself as well, making it very difficult for devolved administrations and local authorities to do anything either.
I mean, Philippa, you're standing down as an SNP MP this year, so I can ask you this, and you can answer honestly. People like Angela Rayner and Penny Mordaunt, I mean, you saw them having a kind of like, yay, sisters moment at the end, and you know, I mean, that's understandable because they're colleagues, even though they're on the other side of the aisles. But I mean, you know, I mean, Angela Rayner always strikes me as being quite a savvy person and quite, you know, somebody who probably came into politics with a lot of integrity. How is it we see these politicians standing up and they're just not being honest with us? How do they square that circle? Is it genuinely just, oh, this is the game of Westminster and people just kind of get sucked into it? Or what happens to the honesty and integrity of politicians when they get down at the big house?
I tend to call it the madhouse, but each to their own. I think there are many MPs who go into politics and go into Westminster for very good reasons. They've maybe been very dynamic in some local campaign and are then approached to stand. The issue, of course, is that once they are there as a part of a party, then their whips are telling them what to do and what to say. Now, the three parliaments I was in, the 15, 17 and 19, were actually very different. I mean, we went down in 2015, the 56, the tsunami, or as Boris Johnson called us, the jocalypse. And, it was often commented to me what a broad range we were, from different sectors. We had a QC, we had a consultant surgeon, we had a psychologist, we had several teachers, we had people from business, we had people from international development. And so when we stood up and were speaking, we often had a hinterland behind us. And certainly, personally, I was always trying to bring the real world of the NHS to the floor of the chamber. I think the power within the big parties, because obviously they don't want reform in Westminster. And we see that the promise from Labour, not just recently, but over a century, to get rid of the House of Lords is already disappearing into the distance because they know it'll eventually be Buggins's turn. So they just want to keep the same system going backwards and forwards. Now, I would say in the first two parliaments, yes, in the chamber, obviously we would be having robust debate, but often people were quite polite to each other outside. There were even friendships that were across parties. I would say that changed quite a lot in 2019 when Boris Johnson took over, particularly towards us. The contempt towards the SNP MPs was palpable both inside and outside the chamber. But I think this is going to be one of the issues if we see UK Labour MPs returned from Scotland, because people need to realise they're not Scottish Labour MPs. When they get off the train and go into Westminster, they are UK Labour. And if you were to go back and go through Hansard probably before 2011, when the discussion about a possible referendum started, you probably hardly heard the word Scotland or Scottish mentioned at all. And what we did say that we would do in 2015 is make Scotland's voice heard. And I think we've categorically done that. And Stephen Flynn, since he's taken over, has done a tremendous job in Prime Minister's questions of doing that. And indeed, in the debate on Friday night, you can totally see why Labour refused to have other parties, including Stephen, included in the Sunak-Starmer debate on Monday. But I think it's important to remember that these big parties have an absolute machine. And during Brexit, I remember seeing whips sitting on the back of the Tory benches where you would go into the lobbies, clearly with a view to intimidate any Conservatives who weren't supporting Brexit or weren't going to vote the way that was intended. But there is this omerta between Labour and Conservatives about the public sector cuts that are coming, about Brexit, about many other issues, because they are in lockstep. And Francis said, who is it Labour is trying to appeal to? They are taking their base utterly for granted. They are chasing Conservatives. They're triangulating Conservative policy in the same way that Blair did. But frankly, Starmer is no Blair. And when we heard the D-Ream song, Things Can Only Get Better, when Sunak was standing like, a druket fish in Downing Street, while, yes, that was highlighting Labour are coming in, but it also really brought home, this is not the optimism that people saw in 1997. This is well, okay, which devil do you vote for?
Well, to end the programme, very briefly, it's we need to take a moment to pause and reflect upon, in the 6th of June 1944, the Allies launched the D-Day invasion on the beaches of Normandy. 80 years on, we see the world remembering the heroism and the bravery of generally young men who went and fought to push back the far right. Nazism and the far right. I think we kind of often forget how close we came as we watch the rise of the far right again. Very briefly, Philippa, how important do you think it is that we reflect upon and commemorate what happened in Europe and what it cost people to free us from the far right 80 years ago as we watch the rise of the far right once more?
I think it's very important. And, we already see that we don't have any veterans from the First World War to remind us of their stories. It's important to capture the stories so that they can be shared with young generations and future generations. Because if you forget history, you run the risk of making the same mistakes again. And I think what we see is sometimes romanticism in the UK. We saw it a lot during Brexit of harking back to the Second World War almost as an excuse for Brexit. But as was said by one of I think it was the Prime Minister of Luxembourg, Britain stood alone at one point against enemies. Why are you standing alone against friends? And I think there is that appreciation of the liberation of Europe, of the Central European countries, that mean they have a very vested interest in remembering D-Day. And we need to remember it as well. And we need to make sure that we capture the stories of veterans so that we're sharing that on. Because as I say, otherwise we could see this rise of the far right again and watch us go round instability, violence and conflict in Europe in the future if we forget what we went through or what our parents and grandparents went through in the early 20th century.
Very briefly, Frances, your thoughts.
I think my enduring memory from the D-Day celebrations was President Macron giving the Légion d'honneur to the veterans. I particularly remember him pinning it on the lapel of a wren, so a woman. And I think that gesture of reconciliation and honour really to the people who helped to liberate France holds out some hope for the future. Maybe we can put this kind of bitterness and petty infighting between Britain and the rest of the EU behind us.
Well, that's a nice way to end the programme. Of course, Scotland voted to remain, but that's another issue altogether. Well, that's it for the Full Scottish. Before I go, I just want to remind you that at Broadcasting Scotland, we depend on the generosity of our supporters. Our programmes will always be free to view. However, if you can afford £5 a month, please consider becoming a Broadcasting Scotland supporter. To everyone who has donated and to everyone who has signed up to make a regular monthly payment, thank you very much. We are focused on securing the future of independent broadcasting for Scotland by growing our subscriber base. So share our programmes, tell folks about it, and if you can, give a wee bum. Thank you again to my guests, Frances Coppola and Dr. Philippa Whitford. My name's Ruth Watson. Have a lovely Sunday.